Hi, Rosa. Uh, Good morning. Your microphone, yes.
Yeah. Now it's on.
Okay. Do you want to share your screen, Rosa? Okay. So please try to do this now with the sharing options of the Zoom. Yes, it works.
Does it work?
Thank you.
Perfect.
I will briefly introduce you before you start. So Rosa Cinelli holds a joint PhD in philosophy and Information and Communication Studies from the University of Milan and Université Côte d'Azur in France. She's currently an a teacher and a researcher at Université Paris 8, where she teaches enjeux contemporains du numérique, so digital issues in the contemporary world, and also arts creation and direction. Her research explores the ways images function as epistemic devices with technological regimes of truth. Formerly a member of the research program Advanced Grant Project an icon. She is currently affiliated with the XR Lab of the Coordinated Research Center, EXT, at the University of Milan in Italy, as well as the research laboratory Paragraph, Université Paris 8. And her work focuses on visual evidence and on the evidentiary uses of images from photography to virtual reality. She also authors chapters as fake and forensic in post-photographico in 2024, and she also trained in photography at the Riccardo Bauer School in Milan and writes on immersive media and contemporary photography for Cineforum Web and Fata Morgana Web. So welcome, Rosa, and the floor is yours.
I will put a timer so that I make sure that I don't talk too much for too much. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the organizers. Thanks, Gaetan. Thanks to all the steering committee for inviting me and for having me here. I must admit, especially yesterday, I was afraid of being a little bit of a dissonant voice in this super experienced cohort because my teaching experience is relatively at its beginning. And also my background is in, as you mentioned, in philosophy, and I've been only recently integrating communication studies and art-based practices into my teaching practices as well, despite them being a part of my former training as a photographer. So this, what I'm presenting now is, if I can, because can you hear the noises? If so, I'm really sorry, but there seems to be like an apocalypse going on in my apartment, so I hope we won't be disturbed. But what I'm presenting now is kind of like the results of my very first year as an assistant professor, as a teaching professor in Paris. And my speech for this reason will be divided into two parts as an outline. The first one will be more of a theoretical framework, which is kind of like what I try to
It seems we the connection of Rosa broke.
Okay, perfect. Everything works now. I'm really sorry for this sketchy part, but I was saying that at the end of my presentation, I will share one of my creations because we were experimenting with Sora 2 with the students, which is like generative video application, but the students are still working on that. So I will nevertheless try to share what I did. The interesting hypothesis that I will try to put on the table is that photography can be a super effective tool, both to apprehend artificial intelligence, both on from media theoretical standpoint, and this is the more risky hypothesis, but also the one which is more work in progress from a creative standpoint, to be aligned also with the values of my research laboratory here in Paris 8. So going on, getting into the thick of it from the first part of my research, I think it's I'm not saying anything new if I acknowledge that generative AI seems to be having like a very strict link, a very strict relationship with fake and falsification since the first beginning of generative images, generative photography, generative images that were brought up to the front. which we may also bring back to this application, which was titled "This Person Does Not Exist," which came up in 2018, which comparing to how rapidly AI is evolving, is now seems like prehistory. But ever since its first beginning and the moment in which it became more and more popular, a variety of research tried to point out how, on the one hand, this type of imagery looked like photographs, with this idea of it being a pseudography or a quasi-photographic image. And on the other hand, with this idea of like AI being and containing an implicit semiotic of fake, which may be ingrained in the very architecture of some models. And yesterday we spoke a lot about GANs and generative adversarial network. And in this paper by Massimo Leone, which is an Italian semiotician, he recalls the very first article with which Goodfellow announced the functioning of the GAN, describing it as a game of the police which had to catch a thief. And so as a game of making believe and not being caught between the generator being the thief and the discriminator being the police who needed not to be fooled by the generator, which is kind of like how this model kind of works. To develop my point a little bit in classes, in my classroom, and also in some talks I've been given, I tried to do this a little bit of an exercise of discourse analysis, starting from one of the most famous, I think, AI-generated images that has been circulated since a couple of years ago, which is Papa Balenciaga or Balenciaga Pop. And I tried to explain and observe a little bit how these images are commented on social media and especially on Reddit. And these images were referred to, of course, yes, as are being referred to as, of course, the first case of AI misinformation case. So there's, of course, this emphasis of like classification, spread of misinformation, which is the more and more urgent. But there are also other orders of discourse that link this type of phenomena more to the participatory or mimetic culture, with this idea of remixing already existing content, or this idea of doing it yourself, do your own Balenciaga Pop, just insert this prompt in an AI model, and you will have your own thing. And lastly, third, and maybe most importantly, there's a large variety of people who kind of like get AI generated imagery not just as fake or like an image which is supposed to deceive, but as jokes, pranks, jests, images who not in the case of the Balenciaga Pop, but in a more larger perspective, could be interpreted as satire, also as political satire. What I try to explain to my students is that this vast variety of problems is not somehow born with artificial intelligence, but seems somehow to echo what photography has been going through since the first digitization, and especially since the passage from analog photography to the digital realm, which is, of course, a matter of a change of signs, to echo Clara's presentation, with the so-called, with the indexical value of the photograph being supposedly lost in the digital. So with this, somehow the digital image not being a trace of reality anymore. There's a lot of nuances and a lot of positions in the debate. I won't have time to develop them all, but what I would like to bring forth in this presentation is that, of course, there's the issue of visual truth, which is kind of like getting more and more brought to the forth. But in this realm, there are also other type of problems and issues, such as the way we communicate with image, which is ingrained with the digital culture, and that had already been brought to the forefront with photography already. To develop this a little bit more in class, I try to share a little bit of a visual culture which is linked to the arrival of the first digitization, and to explain how the emphasis on fake is not, once again, born with AI, but has like a long history rooted in digital media, and especially in digital photography, with the turn of the millennia having been described as this kind of era of falsification by an Italian journalist which wrote extensively on digital photography. With the sudden arrival and uprising of arrival of a lot of digital images that had been retouched and nevertheless published in the press, and that fostered a lot of debate. I don't have a time to describe them all, but just to let you know what these images are, we have some images from the Second War of Lebanon on the top, in which the imaginary of war became a sort of catastrophe movie. And then on the bottom, the kind of touristification and commodification of touristic sites, with the Pyramid of Giza being brought together in order to fit the cover of National Geographic magazine. And finally, the skin color of O.J. Simpson being whitened or blackened at the pleasure of the people who were editing these newspaper journals. The thing that I also tried to pass out, I mean, why photography is important, because of course it kind of like provides tool to understand the debate and also I try to frame the epidemic of fake as something that is not new. It's an important because it helps me to frame contemporary problem for a more genealogically and grounded perspective, but I also try to bring to the forefront like what is new, and somehow it seems like the spread of AI content, AI generated fake content, is somehow helping to maybe surpass what has been considered like a photographic myth of the sans retouche, which is the absence of manipulation in images. As a standard for authentic images. And that more and more in the contemporary debate around AI generated imagery, there is kind of like this new sense that AI is kind of like rewriting the visual semiotic of falsehood, kind of like affirming a new kind of conscious affirmation of this belief in which people kind of like believe in AI generated images despite acknowledging their falsehood. And this with the generation of fake imagery becoming more of like a visualization or an affirmation of possible states of existence, as this semiotician Stefania Chelandri points out, or as a kind of intricate network between theory and fiction, as Kasunugess and Gwenola Wegon point out in a recent essay that they co-authored. So I try to like, it seems like there's more at stake to that, and that the etiquette of fake, hence something that is trying to mislead people, is a little bit too strict, and I'm trying to pass it out to the students. Also by telling them about what is kind of like my latest research hypothesis and maybe utopian way of thinking about this imagery, which is that they somehow may work as counter-ideological tool as well. Once again, bringing this back to this idea from a photographical genealogy, and bringing it back to the way photographs were manipulated and turned into photomontage by John Herschel in the 1930s. Once again, this type of approach, which may be considered as a manipulation, being interpreted and could interpreted by scholars such as the English John Berger, as a way to bring forth democratic thought and to really act as a counter-ideological tool in a time in which totalitarian regimes were brought to the front. So this is like really what I would like to, it's a research topic that I'm currently working on and that I would like to try to develop. Nevertheless, it's been kind of like inspiring to see how students were reacting to this thought, because they were really optimistic. And to bring a little bit of development to my otherwise empty idea, I'm trying to collect, and this is still an open collection, some use cases of what I like to call these counter-ideological uses of AI, with a couple of examples from the recent press. On the left-hand side, we have the Trump images by Nancy Barson linked to the very first election of President Trump, in which Trump and Putin's faces were hybridated to symbolize the current state of affairs, which is like the one linked to Cambridge Analytica scandals, so a massive case of misinformation. Then we have the so-called pre-mediatic or predictive imaginary, in which AI-generated images can serve to pre-envision events that have not yet happened yet. And this is the case of the funerals of Silvio Berlusconi, former prime minister in Italy, a massive mediatic figure. But this image was generated before his death. So it was actually a fake that was really easy to discover as a fake. But nevertheless, that kind of like contribute in shaping a certain idea of like the historical present, or kind of like act like an historian who's looking at the past but at the future. Nevertheless, using an AI generative tool which bases itself from images from the past. So it's an image in which timeline kind of like collide, and so does our sense of like true and fake for how we have inherited it from the photographic medium. And lastly, the image on the right-hand side is an image, maybe some of you have seen it, All Eyes on Rafah, because it's an image that was spread 2 years ago to raise awareness of what is happening still today in Gaza. And it became super viral because it was estimated to have been shared like more than 40 million times in 24 hours. And this type of virality was possible because this content was AI generated and it was not subjected to the sensitive content logo, which would have otherwise limited its virality and its visibility a little bit. So this is where my theoretical framework stops. So from now on, I will briskly maybe move to the more practice-based part. But the idea was like, this is kind of like a little bit of an excerpt of how my theoretical methodology works in teaching AI. So basically, I approached it from what is supposed to be an older medium in order to kind of like better envision what are its potentialities, but also what are their limitations, and maybe what is new and what is at stake. Funnily enough, in one of my courses, which the deliverable were like very open-ended, one of my students picked up a photography-inspired topic for her creative job and her creative assignments, which she herself decided to do creatively, because students were also able to like produce text-based objects. And she explored how generative model apprehend and some type of either photographic genre or photographic characteristics, things that are, how do you say, specific to the photographic medium. And in this case, she explored, in this case, the so-called instant décisif, the decisive instant, which is something that is linked to instantaneity, but also reportage and so-called documentary photography, which is derived from the Poetics of Henri Cartier-Bresson. And she developed an experimental protocol that was based in text-based, so prompting basically at first, but also image-to-image generation, in which she kind of produced a series of iterations, trying to understand how the model, what was the understanding of the model, how the model understood some kind of photographic key concept. So in this case, instant décisif, she started by not mentioning the name of the photographer, but just mentioning decisive moment. And she had like general, of course, she got like super general images that were not specific, but in her opinion, they were called her another Hong Kong photographer. So that like reminded her of somebody else. And the picture became more and more precise with the image-to-image generation model. And so we tried to iterate this model, this experiment, and to mention the name of the photographer. So the results were a lot more precise. But the more times she tried to iterate that, the more the image became kind of like nonsensical in a way. So in a way, precise because the proportions were more accurate in her opinion, but kind of like nonsensical because the people were kind of jumping over nothing. So the whole principle of the instant décisif kind of like seemed to be escaping to generative models, even the mainstream ones. And she tried to do the same, inquiring gender roles in fashion photography. And this is starting from a series by Stephen Maisel, which is a fashion photographer that tackles. I have the title here, but I've lost it because lost it somewhere in the back. I will try to find it. Which is, sorry, makeover madness. I should write my things on my slides so that I don't lose my rhythm. That kind of like tackles the idea of like how gender stereotypes enforce bodily changes in, especially in female bodies. And here, once again, she repeated the same protocol just on a different topic, and the results were, on the one hand, more and more stereotypical and bias oriented when the name of the photographer was not mentioned, and more precise but less critical and less disturbing to watch once the image-to-image protocol was adopted and the name of the photographer was kind of like mentioned. So she got very good, what she deemed very good imitations, but kind of like the whole spirit of the image was kind of lost because the bodies of the models were kind of whole in a way. Lastly, in the very to 1 minute and a half that I still have, I wanted to just give you an example of of the things that I've been experimenting with Sora 2, so with generative video, and it's a project that still has to do with photography. So, and it's an adaptation of a short story by Italo Calvino, which deals with the protagonist of a photographer. The protagonist is a photographer, is a person who goes from being a non-photographer to being obsessed with photography, and has been, because he falls in love with somebody, and it's a little bit of mismatched love. And in my rewriting, I asked, it's an AI rewriting of the short story, in which I asked the ChatGPT basically to imagine the protagonist to be lost in latent space. So we get a lot of imaginaries and of images of how the model itself depicts its own architecture. And I also wanted to introduce a style prompt, which kind of like, in my opinion, was a way to get the model out of what it's usually used to doing. So basically content that is inspired by cinematics, art, special effects, or kind of like the style which is used on social media. And the prompt that I used was inspired by an experimental short film by Bill Morrison, which used molded stock film as a way to reflect on the decay of the way the human life, but also the decay of media. Which kind of like turned to be a little bit of a very actual idea, since, as you may know, Sora 2 has been shut down by OpenAI because it was not deemed to be efficient enough. So it's kind of like making media archaeology in real time, basically. So what you see in these slides, it's kind of like some images that I've been screenshotting from the videos that I got, because I thought they were super interesting. And from now on, I will try to briefly show you some of the clips. What you see on the lower hand side of the slide is the prompt that I used, which is an excerpt from the adapted novel. And what you see on top is like the image that has been generated. So for every iteration, I use the prompt, the narrative prompt, and then the style prompt. And then there's audio that comes, but I will talk on it. So the only limitation, I mean, thing that I introduced was actually to explicitly ask for an image of the latent space. And then
Last, he understood the bargain latent space offers. It can give you
as a way to experiment with video generation a little bit, I try to experiment with extension variability and with linear extension. So basically, I try to extend videos linearly, copy pasting section of the same like over in a linear way, but also copy pasting the very same prompt on different previous scenes to see what could happen. And it's like a really nice experiment, because basically this adaptation could be never ending and could be combined and recombined endlessly. Also, depending on whether this project could eventually be shown. So my time is up. To conclude and to wrap it up a little bit, I thought that also listening to what the previous speakers were talking about, that maybe this visual culture approach could be a tool to counterbalance this sort of like prompt supremacy, which is basically this idea of like reducing the creative act to the simple prompting activity by of course, maybe educating, but not educating, but also like focusing a little more on the questions that are being asked to the AI, or rather than also just or also on or even just on like programming it, because all my approaches are no code so far. I would like to develop to learn a little bit more, but so far, I mean, it's still a work in process. And then maybe the second point is that photography really maybe as a creative reservoir of possible imaginaries that could be stemmed from, that could be taken out of the, it could be originated, it could be like you work creatively. Future directions of course, expansions. So I think I will reach out to many of the speakers who participated to the symposium, because a lot of the tools were really useful, and I would like to learn how to use them also. So thank you for your attention. My presentation is finished. I hope you, I mean, I'm really open for questions if you, and to anything. And let's keep in touch. If you ever feel like contacting or reaching out, feel free.